The airport buzzed with the usual chaos of a Friday afternoon. People rushed in all directions, dragging suitcases and checking departure times on the big screens overhead. The coffee shop near Gate 12 had a line stretching almost to the door. Most folks stared at their phones, but a few glanced up at the tall soldier standing third in line. Staff Sergeant Thomas had been traveling for nearly 20 hours straight. His uniform was still crisp despite the long journey home, but his eyes gave away his exhaustion. 2 tours in Afghanistan had taught him to stand straight even when his body begged for rest. He hadn't seen his family in 11 months, and the thought of hugging his 6-year-old son in just a few hours kept him going. "Just a black coffee, please," he told the young barista when it was finally his turn. The girl behind the counter smiled broadly. "On the house, soldier. Thanks for what you do." Thomas didn't argue. He'd learned to accept small kindnesses with grace. "I appreciate that," he said with a tired smile. That's when he felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of his neck that told him someone was staring. In combat, this feeling had saved his life more than once. Here in the airport coffee shop, it just made him uneasy. Behind him stood a woman in her 50s with carefully styled gray blonde hair and expensive clothes. Her lips were pressed into a thin line as she glared at him. Thomas nodded politely and stepped aside to wait for his coffee. "You shouldn't be giving him free stuff," the woman said loudly to the barista. "My tax dollars already pay for everything he gets." The chatter in the coffee shop dropped instantly. A businessman lowered his newspaper. 2 college students stopped mid-conversation. "Ma'am, it's company policy to offer complimentary drinks to military personnel," the barista explained quietly. The woman wasn't finished. "Well, I don't think he represents the real USA anyway," she said, her voice getting louder. "My father served in Vietnam. My grandfather was at Normandy. That's what real American soldiers look like." Thomas stayed perfectly still. This wasn't the first time, and it probably wouldn't be the last. During his 12 years of service, he'd learned that some people would never see past the color of his skin. An older man in line cleared his throat uncomfortably. A woman with a young daughter moved a few steps away, as if the confrontation might be contagious. No one said anything to defend Thomas, though several people had their phones out now, recording the scene. "I've been on the front lines 3 times defending your right to speak freely," Thomas said calmly. "That's exactly what America looks like." The woman snorted. "Please, people like you are always playing the hero card. My family has real military history going back generations." Thomas accepted his coffee from the wide-eyed barista with a quiet thank you. He could have walked away then. Part of him wanted to. He was bone-tired, and this woman wasn't worth missing his connection. But as he looked around at all the watching faces, especially a young boy clutching his mother's hand, eyes wide with confusion, Thomas knew this moment mattered. "So does mine," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried in the sudden silence of the coffee shop. "My great-grandfather couldn't even drink from the same water fountain as white soldiers when he came home from fighting Hitler. But he wore the uniform anyway." The woman's face flushed red. "That's not what I carry his dog tags with me on every mission," Thomas continued. He reached into his collar and pulled out the worn metal tags that hung beside his own. He believed in an America that hadn't fully believed in him yet. "I served the same country he did, for the same reasons." A teenage girl who had been filming the entire exchange lowered her phone slightly, her mouth open in surprise. The businessman with the newspaper was now standing, coffee forgotten. The line had stopped moving entirely as everyone watched, waiting to see what would happen next. No one knew that what Thomas would say next would leave everyone, including the angry woman, in tears. The woman's face turned a deeper shade of red. She glanced around, suddenly aware that everyone in the coffee shop was watching. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. "You people always have some story ready," she said, her voice getting louder. "I'm just sick of everybody acting like I'm the bad guy for speaking the truth." Thomas took a slow sip of his coffee. 12 years in the military had taught him to stay calm under pressure. This wasn't gunfire or explosions, but it was its own kind of battlefield. "Ma'am, I'm just trying to get home to my family," he said quietly. A middle-aged man in a business suit stepped forward. "Leave him alone. He's served our country." The woman spun around. "Mind your business. You don't know what real service looks like." My daddy came home from Vietnam with shrapnel in his leg, and nobody thanked him. Now everybody falls all over themselves for these soldiers who haven't earned half the respect they get." Thomas studied her face. Behind the anger, he saw something else. Pain, maybe. Or fear. He'd seen that look before in villages overseas where people didn't know whether to trust him or run from him. "Your father served in Vietnam?" Thomas asked. The question seemed to throw her off balance. 101st Airborne. 2 tours. Not that you care. "I respect his service," Thomas said. "The 101st has a proud history." "Don't pretend you know anything about it," she snapped. "My daddy never got his due. They sent him home with nightmares and then forgot about him." The coffee shop had gone completely silent. The baristas stood frozen behind the counter. An older couple by the window shook their heads in disapproval, but nobody moved to leave. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. Terrible but impossible to look away from. "My uncle came back from Vietnam with nobody to welcome him home," Thomas said. "Black soldiers didn't get parades either." The woman clutched her purse tighter. "That's not the same thing." "It's more the same than you think," Thomas replied. He kept his voice even, though his heart was pounding. His mama had always told him to stand tall and speak truth, even when his knees were shaking. A young woman with bright blue hair had her phone out, recording everything. Thomas noticed but didn't change his expression. He wasn't trying to become a viral video. He just wanted this woman to see him, really see him, as a soldier, not a color. "I've lost friends over there," Thomas continued. "White friends, black friends, brown friends. When you're under fire, nobody cares what you look like. We all bleed the same." "Easy words," the woman said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "My daddy always said—" She stopped suddenly, as if catching herself revealing too much. "What did he say?" Thomas asked gently. The woman looked away. For the first time, her confidence seemed to crack. He said the army taught him that not everybody deserves the same chances." A collective intake of breath swept through the onlookers. A young mother covered her child's ears, but didn't walk away. Thomas nodded slowly. "My grandfather told me something different. He said that serving taught him that everybody deserves the same respect, even when they don't give it back." The woman's hands trembled slightly. "That's nice talk for the cameras," she said, glancing at the phones recording them. "But the real world doesn't work that way." "Sometimes it does," Thomas said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. From behind his ID, he carefully removed a worn photograph. He held it out toward the woman, not pushing it at her, just offering. "This is why I serve," he said. The woman hesitated, then took the photo. When she looked down at it, something in her face changed. The anger didn't disappear, but it cracked, like ice beginning to thaw. And what happened next would leave everyone in the crowded airport coffee shop struggling to hold back tears. The woman held the photograph with unsteady fingers. It showed a young boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, wearing an oversized army cap and saluting the camera with serious eyes. Behind him stood an older man in a wheelchair, his chest decorated with medals, his thin hand resting proudly on the boy's shoulder. "That's my son," Thomas said quietly. "And that's my grandfather on his last Veterans Day before he passed." As the woman stared at the photo, Thomas's mind drifted back through the years. His grandfather had been his hero from the time he could walk. On summer evenings, they would sit on the porch swing, and the old man would tell stories, not of battles or glory, but of brotherhood forged in impossible circumstances. "My granddad was part of a segregated unit in World War II," Thomas said, his voice carrying through the hushed coffee shop. "They called them the Buffalo Soldiers. They fought and died for a country that wouldn't even let them eat in the same restaurants as white folks when they got home." The woman's lips tightened, but she didn't interrupt. "He used to tell me about the time their unit got pinned down outside a small French town. They ran out of supplies, were low on ammo. A white lieutenant from another unit risked his life to bring them what they needed. That lieutenant died saving my grandfather's squad." Thomas paused, remembering his grandfather's weathered face, how his eyes would grow distant when he spoke of those days. "Granddad told me that man saw past color because war strips everything away except what matters. When bullets are flying, you don't care if the guy next to you looks like you care if he'll have your back." An elderly man in the corner of the shop nodded slowly, his own eyes misty with recognition. A young barista wiped her cheek quickly with the back of her hand. My grandfather came home to a country that still didn't want him in certain neighborhoods or certain jobs, Thomas continued. But he never became bitter. He said America wasn't just what it was what it could be. He believed that enough to risk his life for it. The woman finally looked up from the photo. My father came back different, she said, her voice softer now. The war broke something in him. He drank a lot, was angry all the time. He blamed everyone, I guess. For the first time, Thomas saw past her anger to the hurt child who had grown up under the shadow of a wounded veteran. War changes people, Thomas acknowledged. I've seen it happen to good men and women. Some of my friends came back with scars you can't see. She handed the photo back carefully, almost respectfully. Your grandfather, he'd teach you to think like this. Thomas smiled slightly. He taught me to see people, not just their outside wrapper. Said that was the hardest lesson he ever learned, but the most important. The coffee shop remained hushed, everyone watching this unexpected conversation unfold. The teenage girl was still recording, but now her eyes were wide and attentive rather than judgmental. My father taught me to be afraid, the woman admitted, so quietly that only Thomas and those nearest could hear. To see threats everywhere. To believe some people would never belong here. Thomas nodded. My grandfather knew your father's fear. He lived with it every day, ma'am. The difference was, he was afraid of what people like your father might do to him, not the other way around. The woman flinched, but didn't turn away. And still he served, Thomas continued. Still he believed. Still he taught me to put on this uniform with pride, knowing what it cost him to wear it when almost nobody wanted him to. Thomas glanced around at the crowd that had gathered. Some were recording, others just watching, but all were captivated. Among them was a young black woman, perhaps college age, watching him with a mixture of pride and pain. When I put on this uniform, Thomas said, turning back to the woman, I carry my grandfather with me. I carry your father too, and every other American who served, whether they would have accepted me or not. That's what this uniform means. The woman's eyes glistened with unshed tears. And in that moment, something changed in the atmosphere of the crowded airport coffee shop. The tension began to give way to something else, something unexpected that no one present would soon forget. As the assembly ended and students filed out, many stopped to shake their hands or ask questions. But the most powerful moment came when a young black student approached Mrs. Clark hesitantly. My brother just enlisted, the student said. I was worried about him facing, you know. Mrs. Clark took the student's hand between her own. Tell your brother I said thank you, she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Tell him his service matters. All of it matters. And as Thomas watched this exchange, he knew his grandfather would have been proud. The woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue offered by a nearby teenager. The coffee shop remained unusually quiet, everyone frozen in this unexpected moment. Thomas took a slow breath, weighing what to do next. He could walk away now. He'd made his point. His flight would be boarding soon, and home was waiting. But something told him this moment mattered more than just catching a plane. I don't know your name, Thomas said gently, and you don't know mine. But we're connected, whether we want to be or not. Your father served. My grandfather served. Both of them came home to a country that didn't know what to do with them. The woman nodded slightly, her anger now replaced by something more complex. My father died 3 months ago, she said, her voice catching. I'm bringing his ashes to Arlington. That's why I'm here. A ripple of understanding moved through the onlookers. The context of her anger suddenly made more sense. Grief often wears the mask of rage. I'm sorry for your loss, Thomas said, and he meant it. Was he career military? 26 years, she replied, a hint of pride breaking through her pain. He wanted to be buried with his brothers in arms. An older man in the back of the shop, wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap, removed it and held it against his chest in silent respect. My grandfather used to say there's a special bond between those who served, Thomas said. Even when they disagree on everything else under the sun, they share something most civilians can't understand. The woman's shoulders relaxed slightly. Dad would say the same thing. Always talked about his men like they were family. Thomas nodded. That's how it is. The person next to you might look different, pray different, vote different, but when things get rough, none of that matters. You trust them with your life, and they trust you with theirs. A young barista who had been watching wide-eyed stepped forward with a fresh coffee for the woman. "On the house," she said quietly. "For your father's service." The woman accepted it with a murmured thank you, words that seemed difficult for her to say. She took a sip, then looked back at Thomas. "You have kids?" she asked. "A 6-year-old boy," Thomas replied, smiling slightly. "He thinks this uniform makes me a superhero." "My dad never talked about Vietnam," the woman said. "Not really. Just bits and pieces when he'd had too much to drink. Said some things were better left over there." Thomas understood. He had his own memories locked away. Things his son would never know about, things that woke him in the night sometimes. "We all carry things home," he said, "some heavier than others." A businessman checking his watch suddenly paused, struck by Thomas's words. A young couple who had been pretending not to listen now watched openly, their coffee growing cold. "Dad always said nobody back home could understand what it was like," the woman continued, almost to herself. "He said coming home was harder than going to war." Thomas nodded. "My first tour, coming home felt like landing on another planet. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt right. Took months before I could sleep through fireworks or drive under an overpass without checking for snipers." The woman looked at him with new recognition. Dad would jump at car backfires. 40 years later, and he'd still hit the ground sometimes. "Post-traumatic stress doesn't care what color you are," Thomas said quietly. "It doesn't check your politics or your background before it takes hold." The coffee shop had become so silent you could hear the hiss of the espresso machine. Every person there seemed to be holding their breath, witnessing something rare and precious, two people finding common ground where there had been only division. Thomas glanced at his watch. His flight would board in 15 minutes. He had a choice to make, catch his plane or finish what had started here. Looking at the woman's face, seeing the decades of pain and anger beginning to crack, he knew what his grandfather would have done. And in that moment, Thomas made a decision that would change not just this woman's life, but his own. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "What was your father's name?" he asked the woman. She hesitated, then answered quietly. "Robert Wilson, Staff Sergeant Robert Wilson." Thomas nodded and made a quick call. "Hey, it's me," he said to someone on the other end. "I'm going to need to catch a later flight." He listened for a moment. "Family emergency, sort of. I'll explain later." The woman's eyes widened as Thomas hung up. "You don't have to." "Some things are more important than catching a plane," Thomas said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "My boy will understand waiting a few more hours to see his dad." By now, even those who had been pretending not to listen had given up the act. The entire coffee shop was watching as this unexpected story unfolded before them. "Ma'am, I'd like to tell you something about this uniform," Thomas said, his voice soft but carrying in the hushed space. "When I first put it on, my drill sergeant, a white man from Alabama with more combat experience than the rest of our platoon combined, told me something I never forgot." He smoothed his sleeve, the fabric crisp despite his long journey. He said, "This uniform doesn't care who wears it. It only cares if you're willing to live up to what it stands for." The woman clutched her coffee cup tighter, her knuckles white. "I've served with men and women from every background you can imagine," Thomas continued. "Farm kids from Idaho, city kids from Detroit, rich kids running from family expectations, poor kids looking for a way out. Some of them became my closest friends. Some of them died in my arms." His voice caught slightly, and he paused to compose himself. No one in the coffee shop moved. "I held a white boy from Kentucky as he bled out calling for his mama. He saved my life that day. And a Puerto Rican medic from the Bronx who'd never left New York before joining up risked everything to drag both of us to safety." The elderly man with the Vietnam veteran's cap nodded slowly, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Your father," Thomas said gently, "he probably knew men like that too. Men who didn't look like him, but who would have died for him without hesitation. That's what this uniform means to me. Not just the flag on the shoulder, but the promise we make to each other." The woman's lips trembled. "He had a friend," she said hesitantly. "A man named—" She stopped, struggling with the memory. "Dad called him Doc. Always said Doc saved more lives than anyone else in their unit. I saw a picture once. Doc wasn't white. Thomas nodded. The battlefield doesn't see color. Neither do the nightmares afterward. Dad used to wake up screaming, the woman admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom said he'd call out for Doc sometimes. A young man in the corner wiped his eyes with his sleeve. The teenage barista had stopped pretending to wipe the counter and was openly crying. I think, Thomas said carefully, that your father and my grandfather might have had more in common than either of us realized. The woman looked down at her hands. Maybe, she conceded. But Dad always taught me that some people just didn't belong here. That they weren't real Americans. Fear teaches people strange lessons, Thomas said. My grandfather had his own fears. He taught me to be twice as good, twice as respectful, twice as careful around police. Different fears, different lessons, but both of them trying to protect their children in the world as they understood it. The woman looked up at him, really seeing him perhaps for the first time. You're missing your flight for this conversation, she asked, disbelief in her voice. Thomas smiled slightly. Your father deserves to be honored for his service. And so does mine. And my grandfather. And every other American who put on this uniform, no matter what they looked like or where they came from. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and metallic. When he opened his palm, an old, tarnished set of dog tags gleamed in the coffee shop's light. These belong to my grandfather, he said. I'd like to walk with you to Arlington if you'll let me. We can honor your father together. And in that moment, as the woman stared at the dog tags resting in Thomas's outstretched hand, the first tear finally broke free and rolled down her cheek. The coffee shop had become so quiet you could hear the airport announcements echoing from the main terminal. Everyone watched as the woman reached out with trembling fingers and touched the worn dog tags in Thomas's palm. Wilson, she said, reading her father's last name on Thomas's military ID. Any relation to Colonel Wilson from the 5th Infantry? Thomas shook his head. Common name in the service, he said with a small smile. My grandfather used to say it was the easiest name to remember when officers were shouting orders. For the first time, the woman's lips curved upward, not quite a smile but something close to it. Dad said the same thing. An airport employee who had been watching the scene unfold stepped forward. Excuse me, sir, he said to Thomas. I couldn't help overhearing. If you're headed to Arlington, there's another flight in 3 hours. I might be able to help you get on it. That's very kind, Thomas replied. Thank you. The employee nodded. My brother serves 10th Mountain Division. It's the least I can do. As the employee stepped away to make a call, Thomas turned back to the woman. What was he like? Your father? The question seemed to catch her by surprise. Most people asked about his service record or his rank, not who he was as a person. Strict, she said after a moment, but fair. He expected the best from everyone. Couldn't stand laziness or excuses. She paused, remembering. He could be hard to live with, but he taught me to stand up for myself. To never back down when I believed in something. Sounds like my grandfather, Thomas said. He'd make me redo my homework if the handwriting wasn't neat enough. Said excellence wasn't optional. The crowd in the coffee shop had begun to shift. What had started as voyeuristic curiosity, watching a confrontation, had transformed into something else. They weren't just spectators anymore. They were witnesses to something rare and valuable. An older woman approached hesitantly. My husband was in Vietnam too, she said. 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines. He never talked about it either. The woman nodded, recognizing a shared experience. Dad would only talk to other vets, said nobody else would understand. Mine too, the older woman said, like they had their own language. As they spoke, more people began to share. My daughter's in Afghanistan right now, said a man in a business suit. My uncle was at Normandy, added a college student. My sister just finished basic training, a teenage girl offered shyly. One by one, people in the coffee shop found connections, invisible threads linking them to strangers they'd been standing next to moments before. The atmosphere had completely transformed from tension to something approaching communion. Thomas watched it happen with a sense of wonder. This was why he served, not for grand ideals of patriotism that politicians talked about, but for moments like this. Real people finding common ground in a divided world. The woman seemed equally surprised by what was happening. I never thought, she began, then stopped herself. Never thought what? Thomas asked gently. I never thought I'd be standing here talking to someone like you, she admitted. Dad always said to keep to our own. That mixing just caused problems. And yet here we are, Thomas said, finding out we're not so different after all. She looked down at her coffee, then back up at him. I said terrible things to you. Things I can't take back. Words can hurt, Thomas acknowledged. But they can heal too. It's what we do next that matters most. The airport employee returned with news about the flight. While they talked logistics, the elderly Vietnam veteran approached the woman. I served with a Robert Wilson, he said. Delta Company, 68 to 69. Tall fellow, had a scar above his right eye. The woman stared at him in shock. That's him. That was my dad. The old veteran's eyes filled with tears. He saved my life near Khe Sanh. Carried me a mile to the medevac after I stepped on a mine. He held out his hand, showing fingers missing on one side. I never got to thank him. The woman covered her mouth, overwhelmed. He never told me. He never talked about any of it. The best ones never do, the veteran said. They just carry it. As they talked, sharing memories of her father, Thomas stepped back, watching something beautiful unfold from what had begun as ugly confrontation. Around them, other conversations had started, strangers connecting over shared experiences, shared losses, shared hopes. The teenage girl who had been recording everything approached Thomas hesitantly. Is it okay if I share this online? She asked. People need to see this. Thomas thought for a moment. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the most important ones, he said. If it helps someone else find common ground with a stranger, then yes. The coffee shop had become so quiet you could hear the airport announcements echoing from the main terminal. Everyone watched as the woman reached out with trembling fingers and touched the worn dog tags in Thomas's palm. Wilson, she said, reading her father's last name on Thomas's military ID. Any relation to Colonel Wilson from the 5th Infantry? Thomas shook his head. Common name in the service, he said with a small smile. My grandfather used to say it was the easiest name to remember when officers were shouting orders. For the first time, the woman's lips curved upward, not quite a smile but something close to it. Dad said the same thing. An airport employee who had been watching the scene unfold stepped forward. Excuse me, sir, he said to Thomas. I couldn't help overhearing. If you're headed to Arlington, there's another flight in 3 hours. I might be able to help you get on it. That's very kind, Thomas replied. Thank you. The employee nodded. My brother serves 10th Mountain Division. It's the least I can do. As the employee stepped away to make a call, Thomas turned back to the woman. What was he like? Your father? The question seemed to catch her by surprise. Most people asked about his service record or his rank, not who he was as a person. Strict, she said after a moment, but fair. He expected the best from everyone. Couldn't stand laziness or excuses. She paused, remembering. He could be hard to live with, but he taught me to stand up for myself. To never back down when I believed in something. Sounds like my grandfather, Thomas said. He'd make me redo my homework if the handwriting wasn't neat enough. Said excellence wasn't optional. The crowd in the coffee shop had begun to shift. What had started as voyeuristic curiosity, watching a confrontation, had transformed into something else. They weren't just spectators anymore. They were witnesses to something rare and valuable. An older woman approached hesitantly. My husband was in Vietnam too, she said, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines. He never talked about it either. The woman nodded, recognizing a shared experience. Dad would only talk to other vets, said nobody else would understand. Mine too, the older woman said, like they had their own language. As they spoke, more people began to share. My daughter's in Afghanistan right now, said a man in a business suit. My uncle was at Normandy, added a college student. My sister just finished basic training, a teenage girl offered shyly. One by one, people in the coffee shop found connections, invisible threads linking them to strangers they'd been standing next to moments before. The atmosphere had completely transformed from tension to something approaching communion. Thomas watched it happen with a sense of wonder. This was why he served, not for grand ideals of patriotism that politicians talked about, but for moments like this, Real people finding common ground in a divided world. The woman seemed equally surprised by what was happening. I never thought, she began, then stopped herself. Never thought what? Thomas asked gently. I never thought I'd be standing here talking to someone like you, she admitted. Dad always said to keep to our own. That mixing just caused problems. And yet here we are, Thomas said, finding out we're not so different after all. She looked down at her coffee, then back up at him. I said terrible things to you. Things I can't take back. Words can hurt, Thomas acknowledged. But they can heal too. It's what we do next that matters most. The airport employee returned with news about the flight. While they talked logistics, the elderly Vietnam veteran approached the woman. I served with a Robert Wilson, he said. Delta Company, 68 to 69. Tall fellow, had a scar above his right eye. The woman stared at him in shock. That's him. That was my dad. The old veteran's eyes filled with tears. He saved my life near Khe Sanh. Carried me a mile to the medevac after I stepped on a mine. He held out his hand, showing fingers missing on one side. I never got to thank him. The woman covered her mouth, overwhelmed. He never told me. He never talked about any of it. The best ones never do, the veteran said. They just carry it. As they talked, sharing memories of her father, Thomas stepped back, watching something beautiful unfold from what had begun as ugly confrontation. Around them, other conversations had started, strangers connecting over shared experiences, shared losses, shared hopes. The teenage girl who had been recording everything approached Thomas hesitantly. Is it okay if I share this online? She asked. People need to see this. Thomas thought for a moment. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the most important ones, he said. If it helps someone else find common ground with a stranger, then yes. What had started as an angry exchange in an airport coffee shop had become something no one present would ever forget. 3 months later, Thomas stood at the podium in a high school gymnasium. The air smelled of floor polish and teenage energy. Rows of students watched him with varying degrees of interest as he adjusted the microphone. I didn't plan to be here today, he began. 3 months ago, I was just a soldier trying to get home to my family after a long deployment. The students shifted in their seats, another boring assembly about patriotism, some clearly thought. But in the front row sat a familiar face, the woman from the airport, her hair styled differently, her expression softer than he remembered. But something happened in an airport coffee shop that changed my life, Thomas continued. And apparently, it changed a lot of other lives too. On the screen behind him, a video began to play, the now familiar footage shot by the teenage girl. It had gone viral within days, reaching millions of viewers. News stations had picked it up, talk shows had discussed it, and somehow Thomas had found himself invited to speak at schools and community centers about what people were calling the coffee shop miracle. He hadn't wanted the attention at first. His commanding officer had worried about the publicity. But when letters started pouring in from veterans and civilians alike, Thomas realized this story wasn't just about him. I met someone who looked at me and saw only my skin color, Thomas said as the video played silently behind him. Someone who didn't think I had the right to wear this uniform or represent this country. Several students glanced at the woman in the front row, whispering behind their hands. I could have gotten angry. I could have walked away. But something my grandfather taught me kept running through my mind. He said, when someone can only see what divides us, show them what unites us instead. The woman in the front row nodded slightly, her eyes never leaving Thomas. We live in a time when it's easier to shout than to listen. Thomas continued, easier to hate than to understand. I'm not saying it's simple to build bridges when someone's burning them in front of you. But sometimes the person holding the match is just scared of what's on the other side. The gym had grown quiet, even the restless teenagers sensing the weight of his words. That day, I walked with Mrs. Clark to Arlington Cemetery, he said, gesturing toward the woman. We stood together as they laid her father's ashes to rest with full military honors. And something happened that neither of us expected. Mrs. Clark rose from her seat and joined Thomas at the podium. The students watched in surprise as she took the microphone. I was raised to fear people who didn't look like me, she said, her voice steady. My father, a decorated veteran, taught me that lesson and I never questioned it. Until that day in the airport when this man, she looked at Thomas with clear eyes, showed me more respect than I deserved. She turned back to the students. The hardest thing in life isn't standing up for what you believe. It's being brave enough to question those beliefs when they no longer make sense. A girl in the third row wiped tears from her eyes. A boy who had been slouching sat up straighter. Staff Sergeant Thomas didn't just miss his flight that day, Mrs. Clark continued. He missed seeing his son after 11 months away. He gave up those precious hours to walk with a stranger who had just insulted him in public. That's the kind of courage they don't give medals for. She handed the microphone back to Thomas, who smiled at her with genuine warmth before addressing the students again. We visited Arlington together, and as we walked among those white stones that all look exactly the same, Mrs. Clark pointed something out to me that I'd never really thought about before. He paused, letting the image sink in. Those headstones don't mention skin color. They don't list political parties. They simply honor service and sacrifice. Side by side for eternity are people who might never have spoken to each other in life, but in death they share the same sacred ground. A teacher in the back of the room openly wiped her eyes. Mrs. Clark and I still disagree on plenty of things, Thomas said with a small smile. We've had some pretty heated discussions over coffee these past few months, but we've learned that disagreement doesn't have to mean disrespect. Mrs. Clark nodded, smiling back at him. The greatest honor of wearing this uniform, Thomas concluded, isn't fighting for your country. It's building a country worth fighting for. And that happens one conversation at a time, one moment of understanding at a time, one person brave enough to listen instead of shout.